the U.S. Navy's many great technical achievements after World War II, few surpassed the dramatic might, power, and capabilities of its Midway-class carrier, the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. Commissioned on October 27, 1945, from the New York Naval Shipyards, the 1,000-foot-long, 64,000-ton FDR was one of the first ships in the Navy's fleet to carry nuclear weapons full-time.
The Franklin D. Roosevelt was a very capable ship in every stretch of the imagination. She was an experimental floating active laboratory for the entire Navy Department.
According to many of the men who served aboard the FDR, the ship's sophisticated capabilities caused the carrier to be at the center of one of the great USO mysteries of the 20th century.
I have no doubt about the existence of UFOs and their interaction with the Franklin D. Roosevelt, and there have been many other sailors out there who've had the same experiences I have had.
There's probably a good connection with the USS FDR and the nuclear weapons and the UFO sightings. There's a magnet for UFOs.
Chet Gruzinski served aboard the FDR from July 1958 until December 1960 as a fireman and metalworks engineer. He says his harrowing close-range encounter with a large USO-like object in September 1958 off Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, has distressed him ever since. He tells his story on camera for the first time.
We're down below decks this evening between 8 and 9 o'clock. It was dark outside. A bunch of men come running up the ladder from the engine. My buddy then said, hey, Red, why don't you go up there and see what's going on? So I followed those men all the way up the ladder, up to the hangar deck, all the way up to the flight deck.
Gruzinski witnessed a cigar-shaped UFO traveling at an incredible speed toward the FDR. He also comments that the object made no sound and maneuvered unlike any man-made aircraft.
We had no air operations going on. The flight deck was quiet up there. And this thing just came right at us, and I could see what the light was when it came at our ship. It was a row of windows with figures inside, and they got close enough I could feel the heat on my face and those figures looking at us through those windows. And the impression I got that those figures were looking at us were not human beings. And then this thing turned like a bright red-orange color, and I could see the shape of it. It was a cigar shape when it turned colors, and then it just took right off like that.
Gruzinski further reports that this bright USO-like craft rose from the water and remained relatively silent over this 45-second event before flying away. Approximately 25 of his shipmates reportedly witnessed this event as well. Most, he says, were quickly transferred off the FDR. Even more curious, he alleges that within hours, the ship's logbook was altered.
When I got the deck log, a lot of things were blackened out on the logbooks. There's nothing in there. And the witness was trashing off the ship, and they probably, I imagine they must have had to sign some papers to say something about it, but I never had to sign anything like that, maybe because I didn't say that much about it, you know.
After almost 50 years, his search for answers about what really happened that night continues.
I'm still trying to find these men on the flight deck. I didn't have to sign the papers. I wasn't transferred off the ship. I got a lot of whys. What happened? Why? That's what it is. That's why I've been spending all these years of research on it.
But Gruzinski is not alone in his belief that he witnessed a UFO while serving aboard the FDR. A second FDR veteran, Harry Jordan, served aboard the FDR from 1962 until 1965 as Seaman First Class. His rating as a radar operator put him in charge of one of the world's most advanced and sensitive radar systems.
She also had the capability of jamming rockets, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and even break through some of the countermeasures being put upon us by Soviet bloc countries.
While on duty in 1963, Jordan says he became part of another significant USO event aboard the ship that has remained secret until now.
The Roosevelt definitely attracted UFOs because of all of the technical equipment and all of the armaments that she had, and also nuclear weapons.
Jordan agreed to tell his mysterious and alarming story of possible USO contact for the first time.
I do remember the incident and the details of it because it just stays with you when you've gone through this.
October 2nd, 1962, off the coast of Sardinia, approximately 2 a.m. Jordan stands watch over his radar monitor. All is normal on this unusually warm fall night. Suddenly and without warning, he says, a contact abruptly appears on his screen, an object 600 miles downrange at an altitude almost impossible for conventional aircraft to reach at the time, 80,000 feet.
First blip came on at the beginning of about 2.5 hours into the watch. It was 600 miles from the ship at 80,000 feet. Then it came into 300 miles at about 35,000 feet, and then it came into about 10 miles at 10 to 15,000 feet from the ship off our port side. I reported it to the watch commander at the time, and he came over, went through the same process and confirmed it, and reported it to the officer of the deck on the bridge. Then the officer of the deck on the bridge woke up the captain after this contact started to move.
An object on Jordan's screen begins moving at a speed and on a course that, he believes, would have crushed any man-made aircraft.
This thing was covering 10 miles in just a few seconds, and it was traveling about 4,000 miles an hour. It was making right-angled turns, and it was almost like a Z pattern if you took about 4 Zs and lined it across your scope. So I could tell that she was going pretty fast, and then so when she stops, they didn't have any heat signature. Okay? This was highly unusual.
After Jordan makes his report, he says the FDR's captain orders the launch of a pair of Phantom II jets to analyze the situation.
They went to afterburners and then launched one right after the other. They left the Rosie and headed up on a course of about 012. So then I thought immediately that there might be something new going on here, because that wasn't following protocol as far as normal ship operations that I was used to.
The Phantom jets, now about 20 miles downrange, still see contact with the object. Jordan reports that the blip on his radar screen continues to dive close to the USS FDR before it disappears in a literal flash.
It's being recorded on the view board up on the right-hand side in CIC, and then the contact winked out about 20, 30 seconds after and I could hear one of the pilots say, "What the?" That's all I heard.
Moments later, he says, as quickly as it disappeared, the target returns, but now it's bigger and closer.
The Phantom II's landed, and then it winked back on again off the port side of the ship, and someone yelled out in CIC, you know, "What the hell is that?" And I bet you had 15 people out there with binoculars looking.
2:32 a.m. In full view of the FDR's crew, the USO reportedly hovers for a moment, several hundred feet from the ship, before disappearing.
I saw the Z pattern, and it stopped. It winked out, and then it was gone. I know what the fingerprints are of the electronics on Soviet aircraft, Korean aircraft, Chinese, MiGs, you name it. If it had been a meteor, it would have burned up in the atmosphere. And I have seen meteors streak across the scope, but it only happens in about 2 or 3 seconds. I mean, it's gone.
2:36 a.m. Jordan records the event in his logbook as a UFO incident. Seconds later, he says his commanding officer bursts in.
"Jordan, what did you put in your log?" And I had UFO in there, and I had the contact number at the time. I held it up in front of the commander, and he says, "You can take that out." My commander acknowledged to me in not so many terms that, "Yeah, Jordan, that's what it was, but no, Jordan, nobody else is to know." Period. I had too much respect for him and the Navy to say anything about it for over 20 years. This was an historical moment for the United States Navy, and it was left out of the logs.
As astonishing as these mysterious first-hand encounters aboard the FDR might be, they are far from the only ones. During her unusually brief 32-year commission, the FDR will host at least a half-dozen similar events.
The FDR seemed to have been attractive to USOs. She certainly saw a lot of them.
Coming up, the 1952 NATO mission Operation Mainbrace is rocked by continuous UFO and USO reports. The lead ship, the USS FDR.
Wallace Litwin took photos of the flying disc going over the USS FDR in Operation Mainbrace.
I've interviewed 3 people separately who have been on the FDR where large UFOs have been seen over the ship, observing it, making its presence known, and at times interfering with what appears to be some of the electronics on the ship.
The Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the first aircraft carrier to carry nuclear weapons, and UFOs seem to be drawn to anything that's nuclear related. The first instance of this occurring was in the North Sea off England on NATO operations.
September 1952. NATO initiates Operation Mainbrace, the first cooperative multilateral maneuvers since the war.
The FDR was part of a NATO fleet exercise off Denmark called Operation Mainbrace. The FDR and the RAF and British aircraft carriers were witnesses to one of the most incredible multiple USO sightings in history. The Ministry of Defense in the UK actually wrote it up as a USO sighting.
The exercise involves 200 ships, 1,000 planes, and over 80,000 men from its member nations in the waters near Denmark. As one of the largest and most advanced ships of the time, the USS FDR leads the way.
She was part of a task force that was sealing off the Russian submarine access through the North Sea into the Atlantic. Extremely important because what if there had been a USO base underneath the North Sea in that area north of Europe? We were surveilling them, they were surveilling us.
September 13th, 1952. The Danish destroyer Willemoes is in the Baltic Sea north of Bornholm Island. Lieutenant Commander Schmidt-Jensen and several crew members reportedly see a luminous triangular-shaped object moving at high speeds above the water, in close proximity to the main fleet. The bluish object travels westward, then suddenly turns southeast, directly toward the FDR. Over the next week, there are several more sightings stretching from Denmark back to the Air Operations Command bases in Scotland. September 20th, 1952, 7:30 p.m. 3 Danish officers reportedly observe a shiny disc-shaped object rise from the water and pass over them, again headed toward the NATO fleet and the FDR. The fast-moving metallic UFO heads east and disappears into the cloud layer. September 21st, 1952. Less than 24 hours later, 6 British pilots above the North Sea spot a shiny spherical object rising from the water and stealthily approach the fleet's location. They reportedly give chase, but the swift-moving object evades their pursuit. FDR veteran Jordan says that he spoke to a witness over 40 years ago.
They had a sonar contact from 3 or 4 destroyers, and they couldn't figure out what the hell it was because it was moving with them, and the damn thing was like a quarter mile wide, and it came up out of the water, and when it did, it dinged one of the ships, and that was later reported as a collision between 2 destroyers. And he says that's not what happened, because he went up and he said this damn thing came up out of the water and flew up.
According to reports, all of these sightings share a similar eerie trait. The witnesses uniformly feel that these USO objects, whatever they might be, are actually observing the naval exercises at close range.
After Operation Mainbrace, there were so many sailors who saw the objects and airmen from the RAF that saw the objects. This wasn't just 1 or 2 people. These were crew members on the USS FDR. So this is one of those very famous multiple sightings where everybody saw these objects.
One journalist aboard the USS FDR during the operations had perhaps the very best view of this reported swarm of USO activity through his camera lens. September 20th, 1952, 11 a.m. Several crewmen witnessed yet another fast maneuvering spherical USO rise from the water to the sky just behind the fleet. Journalist Wallace Litwin, on board the FDR documenting the operation, points his 35mm Canon camera at the horizon and quickly snaps 2 images of a fast-moving disk that seemingly defies all laws of gravity. The images were believed to have been studied by the Navy, but no official report was ever filed.
Wallace Litwin took photos of the flying disc going over the USS FDR in Operation Main Brace. I got copies of his photographs there. It shows the object going over the ship, and you see the ship's superstructure and part of a wing of an airplane. Just like a bright light going over a ship with the full show, but they said it was like a disc light, some of the witnesses.
USO sightings aboard the USS FDR during Operation Mainbrace were not exclusive to enlisted men and non-coms. Some believe that General Dwight Eisenhower may have even witnessed similar objects as a guest aboard the FDR.
I have heard reports that Eisenhower was on the FDR when one of these sightings occurred. The people who are the serious witnesses to operations and events have been afraid to come forward, both because they've been threatened, they're also afraid of being ridiculed.
According to experts, many documents involving Mainbrace remain classified. However, others have been released. Is there a motive for officials to keep 50-year-old events secret?
The military, in fact, the militaries of all first world nations treat these things as threats. They say the fact that they can penetrate airspace, they can go into highly secure areas, they can outfly our fastest jets. Does that mean they're hostile?
Although many FDR veterans and researchers suspect that the ship's advanced capabilities may have made her a target for otherworldly attention, some wonder, could all of this reported activity actually serve as proof?
I have spoken with people over the years since my Roosevelt experience and that one, and have seen the evidence firsthand. To those who have not had those experiences, you cannot know what you've yet to experience, and hopefully you'll believe that they are out there. She was an experimental floating active laboratory for the entire Navy Department.
According to many of the men who served aboard the FDR, the ship's sophisticated capabilities caused the carrier to be at the center of one of the great USO mysteries of the 20th century.
I have no doubt about the existence of UFOs and their interaction with the Franklin D. Roosevelt, and there have been many other sailors out there who've had the same experiences I have had.
There's probably a good connection with the USS FDR and the nuclear weapons and the UFO sightings. There's a magnet for UFOs.
Chet Gruzinski served aboard the FDR from July 9. Gruzinski witnessed a cigar-shaped UFO traveling at an incredible speed toward the FDR. He also comments that the object made no sound and maneuvered unlike any man-made aircraft.
We had no air operations going on. The flight deck was quiet up there. And this thing just came right at us, and I could see what the light was when it came at our ship. It was a row of windows with figures inside, and they got close enough I could feel the heat on my face and those figures looking at us through those windows. And the impression I got that those figures were looking at us were not human beings. And then this thing turned.
Of the U.S. Navy's many great technical achievements after World War II, few surpassed the dramatic might, power, and capabilities of its Midway-class carrier, the USS Franklin D. Roosevelt. Commissioned on October 27, 1945 from the New York Naval Shipyards, the 1,000-foot-long, 64,000-ton FDR was one of the first ships in the Navy's fleet to carry nuclear weapons full-time.
The Franklin D. Roosevelt was a very capable ship in every stretch of the imagination.
1958 until December 1960 as a fireman and metalworks engineer. He says his harrowing close-range encounter with a large USO-like object in September 1958 off Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, has distressed him ever since. He tells his story on camera for the first time.
We're down below decks this evening between 8 and 9 o'clock. It was dark outside. A bunch of men come running up the ladder from the engine. My buddy Vin said, hey Red, why don't you go up there and see what's going on? So I followed those men all the way up the ladder, up to the hangar deck, all the way up to the flight deck. It turned like a bright red-orange color, and I could see the shape of it. It was a cigar shape when it turned colors, and then it just took right off like that.
Gruzinski further reports that this bright USO-like craft rose from the water and remained relatively silent over this 45-second event before flying away. Approximately 25 of his shipmates reportedly witnessed this event as well. Most, he says, were quickly transferred off the FDR. Even more curious, he alleges that within hours, the ship's logbook was altered.
When I got the deck log, a lot of things are blackened out on the log.